Five Nights at Freddy's. Is this where you want to be? Security Breach was not well received when it was released, but it wasn't really poorly received either. We like to call those mixed reviews where I come from. Personally, I knew that Security Breach was an objectively bad game to some degree. It was glitchy, confusing, overambitious, and with enough loose threads to keep a cat occupied for a millennia. But for some reason I still loved it, and that really confused me for a long time. Eventually I gave up trying to figure out why. I liked the game and I left it at that. That was until I came across the exact opposite feeling. A game that is objectively better than Security Breach that I just don't enjoy. I loved Security Breach more than any other FNAF game before it, and that's why it's pretty surprising that I didn't enjoy Ruin nearly as much. The thing is, I wasn't impressed by it, I wasn't excited by it, but I wasn't even disappointed by it. I consumed everything that Ruin had to offer and felt nothing. Ruin is clearly just a better game than Security Breach. I mean, it's literally free, so in terms of value, it's incredible, but that all just made me even more confused. I wanted to find out what about Security Breach made me like it so much, and what about Ruin made it fall flat for me. So, let's start with... It'd be pretty easy for me to say I liked Security Breach for its fascinating and fun glitches, or its incredibly cool and promising potential that got cut before the final release. I think even if you don't agree that I should love a game itself for either of those reasons, you could at least understand how those could be appealing to some degree. But unfortunately for me, I have to tackle the fact that I love Security Breach even outside of those two ideas. Trust me, I'm just as confused as you are, and maybe just as skeptical that I'm even telling the truth. I mean, I could list some things that seem to be commonly considered positives. The map was huge and detailed, the characters had a lot of personality, well, I can't even think of any other elements people would agree were good, but the point is that I'm not even confident that those are the parts of the game that I like. Security Breach has this indescribable quality to it, which is the reason why I could never figure out why I liked it. Well, I'm starting to talk in circles here, and the straws I'm grasping at are becoming so loose that they're starting to unravel, so spoiler warning for all of Ruin, and all of Security Breach obviously, and let's start with the biggest difference that Ruin brings to the table. It's linear. With the open nature of Security Breach causing so many issues with story progression, game performance, and, for a lot of people, scariness, scrapping it all to make a more linear experience was a pretty obvious step. But ideally, a game should try to hide the manufactured nature of its fun, or in this case, its scares. Every game is engineered to inject a very specific experience into the player's brain veins, but that starts to fall apart once it becomes clear just how engineered this experience is. Oh my god, that is a dramatic sound for what is a very gentle slide into place for the rock, with like no dust or rubble or anything spewed out. Obviously, Security Breach's glitches had this effect on a lot of people, but I suppose the difference in my mind was that the glitches in Security Breach were just accidental flaws and I could move past that, while Ruin had intentional design decisions that took me out of the game. I'm not sure. But either way, once you're out of the game, that can have a big impact on scariness. I know the more structured, controlled jump scare moments of Ruin were far better for some people, but I felt the unscripted, natural, scary situations you can get into in an open game. She can't open these.
I can help.
She's going to help you. Oh my god!
Are far more effective than simply walking over a trigger point and having something jump out to spook you. Maybe I just couldn't immerse myself in the game at all because I think too much about the design of video games and how they're made, but every playthrough I've seen had moments where people would catch on to how there's almost never any real danger.
I do love it when it's like, I gotta get off this thing, and then they just do it.
Yeah.
You're just like, okay.
No quick time event, no sense of actual impending doom.
What threw me off is the fact that it started with like a cutscene. It took control of my camera. And in all the other times when there has been imminent peril, I wasn't able to do anything. So why would I think that I would be able to do anything in this one?
To the point that the jump scare noise was treated more as a prompt to look around for the cool moment you just missed than an actual scare.
Where? What? Wait, what just happened?
This happened a lot with the Entity. I feel like the Entity would have been far more frightening if he never announced his appearance with a very clear jump scare noise. Like you're just an AR and you look around and you see him standing in a place he wasn't at before, just staring at you. I don't even know if he would need to do anything. Just him being there would be unnerving enough as long as the atmosphere was good enough to keep up that tension. But ultimately, he and everything else around you that was intended to scare you made sure that you knew you were supposed to be scared.
Don't do it again.
There were never really moments where you'd think, did I really hear that, or did I just imagine it? All of the scares were really obvious, and they were all meant to be the payoff to a built-up tension that didn't get built. Those payoffs themselves were, oh, well, they looked a lot better, but they didn't really work for me. In the first game, people said the jump scare animations were really bad, and I'm not necessarily gonna disagree there. Though, honestly, I feel like the jump scares would have been great if they were just cut off half as early. Maybe even a quarter of the time. In Ruin, the animations hit for a much shorter time. It's a lot more of a burst, a big punch to the gut. A big Freddy Fazbear wallop. No, not a wallop. A stab. You get stabbed. It's short. But the actual duration of the jump scare is still just as long as before. It's just that the impact happens later. The animations are great, but with the audio, it creates this really weird disconnect where there's now this big impact to noise, and as it's wearing off on you is when the impact visually happens. But again, the main issue with these jump scares is that there's no buildup of tension or atmosphere leading up to them. Many people have praised Ruin's environment for looking like a real horror game, but to me that's kind of the issue. This environment is so... it exists, I'll give it that. But being in a building that's torn apart and so blatantly made to look spooky has kinda lost any genuine fear factor for me. It's like if the game was set in Luigi's mansion. Like, yeah, it looks more like it's supposed to be scary, but it isn't. I found the Pizzaplex far better for atmosphere because it's a place you could easily imagine being full of people and activity, but is now just empty. To be fair, Security Breach didn't achieve the level of unsettling atmosphere that it could have. I mean, turning off just some of the lights would have done wonders, but Ruin did achieve the highest level of atmosphere it could have. It's just that that ceiling was far lower than Security Breach's. Again, I think having more unnerving moments and less explicit jump scares like my idea with the Entity would have been much better, because it's not like the Entity was doing much else in the gameplay department.
Oh, don't mind me. I'm not doing anything.
I feel like this will be the least controversial take in this whole video, but the gameplay was boring. And just like with Scariness, a big reason for this is that there weren't really any threats keeping things interesting. The main animatronics barely ever showed up. Pretty much the only times they ever would is if the Entity called them to you. In fact, the only real threats you'd ever see were the Music Men and the Endos. Though, even then, the Music Men were kinda just walls you had to move, but the Endos were carried over from Security Breach, so they were already good. And they now have the bonus of having one of the only interesting mechanics with the mask. The mask was underwhelming as a core gameplay element. The idea of there being two parallel worlds that you can switch between with minor differences is pretty interesting. but there's never really a balance to having to take on or off the mask. If something's glitching, put on the mask until there's a wall that forces you to take it off. It's implied that wearing the mask for prolonged periods is bad, but nothing really happens outside of the entity appearing. And the moment the entity appears, it'll be very obvious.
Whoa.
You just take off the mask, wait a couple seconds, and then put it back on. And that means that it pretty much had no effect. It just wasted time. And if I wanted to waste time with FNAF, I'd try explaining the lore. Again, the Endos had a very interesting interaction where they'd start walking around freely when you wear the mask, unlike in the real world where they do their Weeping Angel statue impressions. But that was the only time there was anything like that. If there were animatronics that could only see you in the mask or only existed in the mask, like real dangers in the AR world, it would maybe create a more interesting balance to switching between the two worlds, but as it is now, having the mask on means you're pretty much safe from all dangers until the entity comes along and tells all the real world threats to ignore your AR immunity. So there's really no reason not to have the mask on most of the time, which isn't helped by the fact that the majority of the puzzles you do require you to wear the mask as well. Other than walking around and watching cutscenes, puzzles were really all you did for gameplay. They were simple, but they could have been really interesting if you were forced to do them under a time crunch or something like that. And while the entity appearing was kind of a time limit on AR puzzles, again all it really led to was players pausing for a second to take the mask off and then just continuing after they wait a bit. The mimic chase at the end of the game kind of gives you a more pressing time limit for a puzzle, but it's really obvious how much the mimic slows down to give you extra time. It makes sense there because it's not like you could run away from him and then circle back to continue the puzzle, but that's why it would have been far more effective if this happened in less scripted sequences. The only puzzle that had you interact with things in the rest of the game outside of just whatever object the puzzle itself was displayed on was the node puzzle. It forces you to walk around the area and look for child nodes, but unfortunately you're supposed to do this with the mask on, so that means there's very little going on outside of beloved Rabbit Man checking in on you. In theory, the camera puzzles made you interact with other elements of the game, like the cameras, but the camera stations were pretty much just puzzle stations. Every review I've seen of Ruin has praised the cameras because, unlike Security Breach, you're forced to use them, but just because you have to use them doesn't mean they're good here. All you ever really do is just go to the one camera it wants you to, press the one button it wants you to, and then leave. Sure, they put some secrets in there that help you unlock the secret ending, but you don't really use these as cameras. At least in Security Breach, there was this idea that you would go into a hiding spot and then check the cameras from within the hiding spot just to see if it's safe to come out. I know most people didn't really use the hiding spots either, but I, as a little baby man, relied on hiding spots and cameras a ton, so overall, in terms of out-of-office camera systems, I feel like Security Breach did it way better than Ruin did. And that kinda sucks, cause it means that my opinion of Ruin so far is that it's incredibly linear, not very scary, and boring. But linear games with uninteresting gameplay can still be good if their story is enjoyable.
When I first found you, you were nothing. You were small, pathetic. But now, you are more. Are you ready?
It's not him.
Okay, yeah, it's FNAF. But I somehow didn't have that many issues with Security Breach's story, like it didn't inhibit my enjoyment of that game, so we've gotta figure this one out. Now, I'll admit, in Security Breach, they tried to tell a linear story despite its open gameplay, and that meant that its open gameplay was forced into being actually kinda linear. So the fact that Ruin was already incredibly linear means that it wouldn't face this same issue. But the main plot of Gregory is trapped, we need to go save him, doesn't really progress until you get down to where he is, and since most of the transitions between areas feel so non-specific, you could really have pretty much any chapter in this game lead to any other one. And that means that the story was only as interesting as its initial hook. And in all fairness, when the first poster of Ruin was revealed, nobody knew what was gonna happen. People were skeptical that Gregory was actually there, they thought it might be a trick, but how it was a trick was still unknown. The problem is, before Ruin even got its first gameplay trailer, people knew. And look, the Mimic is a fine story. He is a cool way to change the context of a ton of confusing plot details without needing to change the details themselves. It's the same reason I thought that FNAF 4's Dream Theory was cool. Saying that Burntrap down in Security Breach wasn't actually William Afton, instead just a robot mimicking Afton's personality, is a pretty good way to address the people who didn't like Afton coming back. But the issue is, every non-canon Security Breach ending was shown to be entirely fabricated by Gregory. Usually, if a game has multiple endings, you should believe that everything shown in those endings is at least actually there, even if the specific outcome didn't happen. For example, in the VIP ending of Security Breach, we see that Freddy's index finger actually has a lighter in it. You'd logically assume that even in the endings where Freddy doesn't burn down the building, he still has that lighter. But Ruin's logic implies that Freddy might not actually have that lighter at all, because we've never seen it anywhere outside of that ending, and that ending was just made up by Gregory's imagination. So what I'm getting at is that it feels like rather than showing that Burntrap was the Mimic all along, they just replaced Burntrap with the Mimic, ruining the entire reason that the Mimic was an enjoyable story to me. Now the Mimic just comes out of nowhere. If they were already removing Burntrap entirely from existence, I would have preferred they come up with a good story rather than just shoving a new unexplained character down there who has even less of a reason to be there than Burntrap did. But obviously the idea of Burntrap was a much worse story than the Mimic, so I guess we can just leave it at that. Another topic that I could talk for far too long about is that the overarching story of Ruin felt unrealistic and ungrounded. I know that's a hot debate in the FNAF sphere, and I could, and originally did, go through every single game to explain how I felt about them being grounded or not, but ultimately, that doesn't really matter here. The main point that I was getting at with all of it is that I think the idea of the story dealing with the horrors of AI and technology could be really interesting. It's a very unique angle for a horror game, and can feel realistic in a genuinely frightening way with all the other AI stuff going on nowadays. But it explores those ideas as if they're sci-fi concepts when they aren't anymore. Randomly mixing in very sci-fi elements like phasing through objects or teleporting and not explaining them at all completely goes against the realism of an AI replicating the voice of someone you trust in order to trick you. There are a lot of other elements of this story that I could go on about for far too long, like that the endings are confusing and unsatisfying to the point that it feels like you need to be a theorist to get any value out of them, or how there's a bunch of rabbit-related things from the rabbit mask to the animatronics with rabbit ears torn into them to the digital rabbit entity and the rabbit animatronic hidden in the backrooms that all didn't lead anywhere because Vanny stopped existing before most of them happened, so it isn't connected to her, and they certainly aren't connected to the Lion Man over here, but I think you get the idea. Ruin gave up trying to work with everything they had from Security Breach. Totally fair. But they retconned everything even when they didn't need to, and they still tried to stick close enough to the original when they didn't need to do that either. As it is now, the story is neither a good continuation of Security Breach, nor a good story on its own. Security Breach's story wasn't that good either, but those flaws only really shined when you tried to solve their finer details, and at least the game had pretty great characters. Well, Ruin doesn't really have characters. Yo, what up, Chica?
Pizza!
Yeah, that's right. Monty has less personality than the mop bots, and Chica, gets to say her iconic line once. But clearly, Roxy comes out on top here, and I think Roxy was my favorite of the three in Security Breach anyway, which is probably what Steel Wool was banking on. But, unfortunately, I didn't enjoy Roxy in Ruin. She does get a redemption arc, and by that I mean she gets a new personality for one scene. Okay, that's a bit harsh. The thing is, the scene is nice. It just comes out of nowhere, and it felt like Roxy was now acting like Freddy instead of herself. I know that there's a bit of a fan theory that Roxy was rebooted into safe mode because of whatever happened here, and that safe mode makes the animatronics really nice and stuff, which has a fine explanation, but I still don't really like it. I enjoyed Roxy for being Roxy, and Freddy for being Freddy. I don't like the idea that Freddy was only Freddy because of safe mode, and that any of the other animatronics could act just like Freddy if they were in safe mode too. Roxy can be an ally to some degree, but I kind of expected it to be more of an I respect you for being good at racing or whatever, but I still want to beat you since I'm clearly better than you kind of thing. A kind of tough love situation rather than a motherly figure. I'm just disappointed that I can't join all the other Roxy fans in being super excited by this progression, because these are characters that people care about from Security Breach.
You ever watch TV? Alright, my love, he's so hot.
Yeah. I know that in a Five Nights at Freddy's horror style, you aren't really supposed to have complex characters that you grow attached to and, more importantly, comfortable with, but you already have them, so they should have at least been used. I feel like going in and preparing all the animatronics and helping them deal with their individual struggles would have been far more compelling than anything else happening in Ruin. You kind of repair Chica somewhat. You give her a voice box back and she says pizza and then dies again. A similar situation with Sun and Moon. You reboot them, turn them into Eclipse, and they say, "That's great, get out of here," and you never see them again for the rest of the game. It just didn't feel rewarding or satisfying. As for the other characters, there's, Freddy? Not really. There's the Entity though, but he was fumbled harder than Vanny in terms of recurring villains in my opinion. Vanny had an incredible beginning and several satisfying endings, but no middle. The Entity had a middle. His introduction was, he's here now, and his only ending was, he's gone now. He's around a whole lot more throughout the game than Vanny was, but I just had no reason to care about him. And unfortunately, the other character you spend all your time with wasn't much better. I didn't find Gregory annoying in Security Breach, but I know some people did. And I can admit that the main saving grace for Gregory was that he always had Freddy to bounce off of. Cassie didn't get that luxury though. She was stuck with Helpy, who was not very enjoyable, nor much of a character outside of the times that he was trying to deceive us. And he didn't have the amazing voice acting of killing Goff to save him either. But did you notice how there were no tutorial pop-ups in the entirety of Ruin? That was actually a pretty good change, but they still had to give those tutorials somehow, and tragically, that was horrible for Cassie's character.
No way. I walked through a big screen and now I'm in Superstar Daycare?
She caught a bad case of horribly written dialogue that prompts the tutorial character to give you another tutorial in a way that's supposed to feel natural but is instead just bad. And if that wasn't bad enough, she almost always did so completely unnecessarily.
I swear that doorway was blocked.
Didn't you already learn this?
Cassie, how do you not real? We've already phased through so many objects that are not real with the help of this mask. I'm just calling it out for you, Cassie.
It feels like Ruin tried to address the fans who didn't like that there was almost always a nice and friendly character around to help you in Security Breach. But Cassie was still kind of written like she was supposed to have something to bounce off of, and all she was met with was the cold, unfeeling void of tutorials. The times when you had your fuzzy companion taken away from you to make you feel helpless for a while in Security Breach were really cool. And the initial idea of having Freddy turn against you at some point later in the game just sounds incredible, but obviously that didn't make it into Security Breach, which is kind of the main point, I suppose. Objectively, Security Breach failing to reach its lofty ambitions left it feeling less polished, less complete, and far more disappointing overall than Ruin by a long shot. But the potential of Security Breach and the ideas behind it excited me infinitely more than Ruin's far lower ambitions. Which is why it's also unfortunate that Ruin didn't try to tap into that gold mine of ideas and instead just did something completely different. Obviously, it all comes down to personal taste at the end of the day, but Security Breach felt like it was the game Steelwool wanted to make, but just couldn't reach the mark on, while Ruin was the game they just made to try to fix their mistakes. So, in the end, I guess Security Breach's intangible quality was passion? Love? I don't know, that just sounds lame. But yeah, I probably could have just gone with that from the start. Oh, and as a reward for sticking to the end of this video, where I almost exclusively criticize Ruin, here's a quick list of things I actually liked from it. The animations are really good, it brought back unused minigames from Security Breach, it actually showed off Bonnie, a lot of the mimic lines in Ruin are actually reused Gregory lines from Security Breach.
What? How is that supposed to help?
Well, that's the line that he uses when That's cool. Candy Cadet.
Like the air horn.
I am only now realizing that's the celebration sound for winning the minigames in Pizza Sim.
Is it? Actually, it's air horns.
And lastly, there's no unused content or cut ideas that would have been so cool that it makes the final game kinda painful to some degree because of how it missed the mark. Overall, I give Ruin an It's Fine out of 10, and I'll be back again soon to spend half an hour trashing on a game I don't actually hate.